shout out his name.
Of all the shit around Brexit, I think the thing that I find the most annoying, the most aggravating, and the most dishonest is the idea that the Brexiters are the ones who want to respect democracy. This is why I keep relentlessly hammering home the fact that the vote was only ever advisory and that it was marred by wholesale illegality, which, in any democracy worth its name, would invalidate the vote and require a second referendum. And yet, these tireless guardians of democracy don't care. So long as they got the result that they wanted, they don't care that there was all this illegality. Now, I'm not pulling this out of my arse. I will show you some articles, some film clips and so on to back up what I'm saying, but I'm not the kind of channel that gives you extended references and everything in the links. I encourage you to do your own research, because honestly, that's probably the only way you'll believe what I'm talking about. As we start, we're going to need to consider the character of the people behind the Leave campaigns, most particularly Arron Banks. Now, Arron Banks was a huge bankroller of Brexit, and it was his campaigns and his money that has most come under scrutiny, though far from the only ones that have. So we need to ask ourselves, what is the character of Arron Banks? What lengths would he go to? What lengths has he gone to in order to try and secure Brexit? Not as a character assassination or an ad hominem, but just to establish whether they're the kind of person who might cheat. To take one example, after the tragic death of Joe Cox, which people on all sides were accused of politically exploiting at the time, but still there was an honourable gentleman's agreement to suspend campaigning for a while. Arron Banks did not respect that agreement to cease campaigning, and while he did ease off on television appearances, radio appearances and so on by various pro-Leave camps, what he didn't do was stop the Facebook advertisements. And they continued to promote pro-Brexit adverts directly after. There have been leaked emails. You can find the Channel 4 clips for this, about this, on YouTube, or you can track down the text of the leaks yourself, should you feel so inclined. But there is just no way around the fact that they did plough on to directly quote. He said to his assistant, Liz Bilney, the campaign group's chief executive, he told her to keep pumping the McKenna video and to up the spend. So rather than suspending the campaign, he upped the spend. This was a video by the hypnotist Paul McKenna to advise on its broadcasts and how to persuade people. Yeah, it sounds like a bad science fiction or political novel, but these are simply the facts. So this was the kind of person who would push on and push more in the wake of someone's death, despite an agreement by all the campaigns, supposedly, to cease campaigning. It's worth just taking a side note here to talk about Facebook and the problem around Facebook. The majority of these electoral shenanigans were centered around social media, and Facebook in particular. Now, why is this a problem? It's obscuring exactly how much was spent. Zuckerberg and Facebook have refused to cooperate with investigations into exactly how big of an overspend there was and exactly how bad the breaches of data regulations and so on were in the campaign. So it makes it very hard for the regulator, for the courts, to truly investigate the extent of what has gone on. And a lot is probably being missed. So when I do finally get to figures, keep in mind that these are just what we know about and can confirm. And this is just another sinister nail in the coffin of Facebook. And the fact that there was illegality is not just wishful thinking on my part. And it is true that the Remain side was also fined, but this was essentially only over accounting errors. The Leave campaign was fined maximally, albeit inadequately, for more serious breaches. Now, not only were they fined by the Electoral Commission, this sizable sum, but the case also went to the High Court. While it did not overturn the result, and while the failure to do so has been seen as a victory for some reason by the Brexit campaign, it confirmed that there had been illegality, and it was really only a loophole that meant that the vote wasn't overturned. There was the £620,000 overspend channeled to Darren Grimes to pay for advertising services that he purchased from Aggregate IQ. This is a shady data analytics and online advertising firm from Canada. That same group, AIQ, also were given another £100,000 via Veterans for Britain, and a further £435,000 via the DUP. Now, all of this was part of a common coordinated spend, and that's where the breach of electoral law is. Now, the smaller amount would already have been about a 10% overspend. When you combine everything, and this is just everything that we know of, we're talking 15% overspend. That's a considerable amount, considering just how narrow the vote was. But don't take my word for it. Listen to one of the lawyers who was making the case for the Remain side.
In May, the Electoral Commission found very serious electoral offences against Leave.EU, which was a subsidiary organisation in the vote. But then, most importantly, in July, against Vote Leave, the main campaign, and it found that Vote Leave had committed very serious electoral offences and imposed maximum fine levels and referred them to the Metropolitan Police. And then in October, there was a judgment in the Divisional Court that found that the Electoral Commission had also given incorrect advice on what could be spent. And the result of that is that effectively Vote Leave spent about $500,000 more than it was entitled to spend. And it spent that money in the last week of the campaign on AIQ and Facebook ads. Now, the referendum was, of course, advisory. So the question then was, what was Theresa May going to do with that advice? And she was absolutely sure that the result was the democratic will of the people.
So she's behaved as if it were binding.
She's exactly.
But it's not a legal nicety to point out that it isn't.
Well, first, it's not binding, but secondly, she's treated it as binding. Yes. And the crucial point was that had it been binding, it would have been voided.
Keep in mind that this information did not come out until after the election that we had, the pointless and stupid election that we had. So the manifestos, as well as being even less binding than the referendum, are no sort of guide. Plus, there's problems with our electoral system that meant that people in a lot of areas, basically have no choice whatsoever when it comes to voting. They tend to vote tribalistically, and realistically in most seats there's only one party that has even the slightest chance of removing whoever is incumbent. So it's non-binding, but if it had been binding, which many of you want us to treat it as though it was, which the parties are treating it as though it was, if it had been binding, it would have been overturned. There's that much illegality even at that early stage. So how did they spend that money, and how does this again speak to the character of the Leave campaign, and in particular Arron Banks? Well, they targeted the far right, and they played on people's fears far more, ironically enough, than the so-called Project Fear.
Throughout the referendum campaign, they relentlessly pushed incendiary messages about immigration. Britain was under attack. The country was being invaded. Europe was allowing terrorists to run amok. The aim, it seems, to fuel tensions over immigration.
Did we at sometimes go a little bit over the top? Probably. It was ruthlessly executed in a business-like way, and, we stayed on message.
This was far from the only thing that they did, but this tactic, targeting of Facebook, the using of memes, not exactly in the sense that we would mean them in the kind of internet native community, but shareable, simplistic messages. This is a tactic that For Britain, Britain First, other far-right groups have used, where they have tied themselves to messages that people could agree with, patriotic Poppy Day appeals, or various other things that people would share, not necessarily knowing who they were, in order to raise their profile. And Leave did a similar thing, but where they couldn't scaremonger about actual news, they went even further.
June 10th, 2016. 2 weeks before the referendum, and two white women are photographed talking to a group of black men in North London. At 10:48, according to these photos, one of these women appears to have been violently attacked in a dark alley. But are these pictures real? They appear to have been staged here in Wood Green in North London by a team working for Arron Banks and his Leave.EU campaign. It's an operation apparently demonstrating how easy it is for people smugglers to get migrants into Britain, and it went viral.
So we've reached the RV here at Gravelines in France. In a moment, my three would-be refugees, or asylum seekers, or whatever you want to call them, will board this boat and we'll make our way back over to the UK.
Leave.EU press released it as an undercover investigation. The Mail Online reported it 2 days before the referendum, and so did the Express.
Look how dead it is.
We asked Phil Campion in to talk us through how this video came about.
These guys, they're not actually migrants, they're British?
Yeah, no, they're all British. They're all people I knew. They're just normal, regular lads,
Yeah.
all ex-soldiers, who decided to come on that trip with me. These were stays, these were stooges.
It's the boat, and its GPS tracker shows what really happened. 2 days before crossing the channel, the boat travels from Dover to Deal, where this is filmed.
Three guys dropped from a rib into the UK, unopposed, absolutely.
Except they hadn't crossed the channel yet. The next day it goes from Dover to Folkestone, where three British men, who haven't actually left the British coast, simply clamber back into Britain.
This is broad daylight. I can do this whenever I like.
After a quick stop at Dover Marina, not far from the ferry port, the boat finally heads to France. When it comes back the next day, there are no drop-offs at Folkestone. It's just straight into Dover, and their journey ends.
So we know that they're willing to lie, that they're willing to cheat, that they're willing to fabricate evidence, and to overspend, and to use illegally acquired data. But what did they do with all that money that they gathered? How did they spend it? How could it have such a big and meaningful effect on the referendum?
A communications researcher analysed the expenditure of the Vote Leave campaign. When I downloaded the invoices and totted them up, almost half their spending was going on a company that I'd never heard of, Aggregate IQ. And it turns out this is this tiny little company on the west coast of Canada, Vancouver Island, that, as far as I could tell, hadn't done any other political campaigns before this. No one really knew who this company was. You couldn't get through to them. The company themselves wouldn't respond to emails.
Who is behind this mysterious company? Why did they receive all that money?
This huge part of the successful campaign had been spent on something that we knew nothing about. So it was just this sort of black hole, if you like.
Legal cases are still ongoing, but AIQ is, if I remember correctly, the first company to be taken to task using the new GDPR rules over its abuse and misuse and probably illegal acquisition of people's data, and then using that data to present highly tailored, highly targeted advertisements to people and political messaging to people. That's how it's so effective. Targeted advertising is massively effective and is a huge force multiplier for whatever funding you put into those campaigns.
Potential voters were sought out for this purpose with the aid of their mobile phones, Facebook, Google, stored interests and location profiles, customized ads for a lot of money.
And you know, £700,000 can do a lot.
On Facebook?
On Facebook, on your browsers, on targeted adverts, especially targeted so well. Any digital strategist can tell you £625,000 to £700,000 can make all the difference.
We're talking about at least a 10% overspend, possibly as high as a 25% overspend, targeted very sharply on vulnerable voters in the last week of campaigning. And this is something that data experts know can be effective. So this is how such a relatively small overspend could have such a powerful swing effect on the final vote.
When the parliamentary committee managed to get a lot of advertisements finally out of the Vote Leave campaign, there was a few ads in there that were about animal cruelty, but they weren't very explicitly making a political argument about the EU and animal cruelty. They were saying things like, if you're against whale hunting, click here.
The emotional ads served as bait. One click and the user was hooked. Then the digital strategists bombarded potential voters with ads. Ads claiming that Britain would soon share a border with Iraq, and that 76 million Turks were on their doorstep, and that the EU was to blame. The ads were often blatant lies, and they were tailor-made so-called dark ads. Only select users could view them on Facebook.
In a democracy, we expect things to be in the open. We expect to be able to challenge things. So as soon as you get into a situation where all these claims are being made privately and directly, and the only people who know about them are the campaigner themselves, the political party, Facebook, and the individual receiving them, that changes the whole dynamic, the whole democratic principle, and undermines the whole democratic process.
This is a vital point. If you believe in the marketplace of ideas, then in order for there to be a marketplace, people need to be able to see, to argue, to debunk arguments from either side. In the case of this specific targeted messaging, using the same tactics that various far-right groups have used in targeting people on Facebook, you don't get to see any of that. You can't counter-argue it. It's invisible. It's financially virtually invisible, and it's socially virtually invisible. There's no opportunity to argue it. There's no marketplace of ideas.
Vote Leave understood how powerful AIQ was. They understood how powerful their algorithms were and the way that they were targeting people was. And that's why they were willing to break the law in order to give them more money.
Nigel Farage's Brexit campaign also relied on digital propaganda. His friend Arron Banks made use of know-how from Cambridge Analytica.
Cambridge Analytica was basically doing the same thing. Grey, at least, possibly black usage of people's information and data, and highly targeted advertising. But what's More interesting about that side is the funding and Arron Banks.
A question for the millionaire donor.
That's a lot of money to be cross about.
Yes.
Well, it seems like I'm only
Got
suggesting.
about 30 businesses involved in diamond mining, involved in insurance, banking, all sorts of businesses.
In the meantime, a parliamentary commission has investigated where Mr. Banks got all the money from that he invested in the Brexit campaign.
He's never been able to say, well, this is where the money came from. It came from money I made from this deal or the sale of this business or money that I've accrued in this way. All he says is it's come from his personal resources. But there's enough concern now that this is a matter of police investigation by the National Crime Agency.
This prompted a group of journalists to take a closer look at Arron Banks' business dealings.
Arron Banks has often said that the money came from one of his companies based in the United Kingdom. And currently the National Crime Agency, the most powerful police force in Britain, is investigating because they think it didn't. They think it came from another one of his companies which is based in the Isle of Man, which is illegal under British electoral law.
Now that's something of a best case scenario, that Arron Banks is just dishonest about where the funding came from and jumped through a few hoops and so on. But he wasn't solvent at this time, for much of this time. So there's a big question over how, even by his underhanded methods that they suspect, there's a big question over how he could have got the money even that way to donate to UKIP at the time, or the campaign later on. Huge question marks.
From late 2015 on, Banks gave around £9 million to the Brexit campaign. At the same time, he himself had serious financial worries.
So his main insurance company, essentially, just a year before he becomes a major political donor, is in serious solvency issues.
Despite these problems, Banks bought 3 diamond mines in South Africa during this time in a very visible manner. He claimed he could mine diamonds worth more than $70 million there. Is that true? The first mine looks deserted. We asked the neighbour across the road.
Oh, for 15 years? Nothing. Okay.
Massive overspends, the extent of which we still probably haven't uncovered. Diamond mines that don't exist. Targeted advertising using stolen, probably, data, as we'll find out as the court cases wind down. The Electoral Commission said it was illegal. The High Court has said that if it was a binding vote, it would have been overturned. There's no question, there shouldn't be any question in anyone's mind that the whole thing was completely undermined by all this illegality. And the excuse that people fall back to is that even if there was cheating, it didn't make that much difference. But the data analysts tell a different story.
To sort of argue that the Brexit referendum is legitimate is basically a lie. Vote Leave won because they had Believe, because they had AIQ, because they broke the law.
In addition to all this, and I know many of you won't want to hear it, there is the question of Russian involvement. This kind of knocks on from the Trump campaign and involves many of the same players, such as Cambridge Analytica. And before you dismiss this out of hand, I would remind you that the Mueller report did not in any way exonerate Trump, and it did not put to bed the idea of Russian interference, only direct collusion and cooperation between the Trump campaign and Russia. Russia did seek to influence the US elections, and they did seek to influence Brexit. The investigations are ongoing, but Banks's mysterious diamond mines may well be a front for laundering money put into the campaign from Russia. It remains to be seen, but there's little doubt anymore that there was at least some interference, even if it wasn't as direct and as cooperative as directly funding and colluding with Banks or the Leave campaign or UKIP or whoever else might have been involved. To sum up though, We have a campaign run by charlatans and liars who are willing to fabricate evidence, who are willing to court the far right, who are willing to abuse personal data in order to present targeted dark ads in a way that cannot be challenged or even seen. Massive overspends with invisible sources of money. We can't even get at the full information because Facebook is refusing to cooperate. We have GDPR accusations going through court. The Electoral Commission agreed it was illegal. The High Court agreed that if the referendum had been binding, it would have to be overturned. You cannot continue to back and try to force Brexit and claim with a straight face that you're some kind of guardian of democracy. Democracy has been usurped, and the Brexiteers who won are as much victims of this as people who voted to remain. Because it has robbed your victory of any legitimacy unless a clean, binding, well-defined second confirmatory referendum is held and is ferociously guarded against illegality and interference. Everyone has lost as a result of these shenanigans. Everyone. But you cannot claim to be for democracy and continue to try and push this through.
The gallows is cold and the gibbet is lonely. We'll make things hard for you here. The gallows is cold and the gibbet is lonely.